to this talk, and I would like to introduce you to Michael Valdez Moses, who's joining us from Duke University this morning. And if I'm understanding this correctly, we get a little sneak preview of a forthcoming book, A Modernist Cinema. And so I'm going to let Michael introduce the context for that book, but we'll have about 45 minute talk and then an opportunity for Q&A, so I hope you keep your questions ready to go after the discussion. The economists in the room after the discussion, you can ask all the questions you would like. So with that very short and paltry introduction, please welcome Michael Valdez.
Thank you for all of you for coming. Really appreciate your being here. It's really a pleasure to meet you. Let me just say, first of all, a book of modernist cinema, it's got chapters on 17 different directors from the first half of the 20th century who are normally not thought of as modernists, since that term is typically reserved for directors who worked after World War II, Antonioni, Fellini, Bergman, and so forth. So the challenge of this volume is to put directors who worked prior to World War II in conversation with modernism, which was an active and lively literary artistic movement across the globe. And I both edited the volume and contributed the chapter on John Ford. But as I worked on this chapter, I realized there was a lot more to the story. So you're getting more than the folks who at Oxford University Press bargained for. And I'd also like to explain something about the title. That saves them the blessings of civilization is a line, as you'll see, from John Ford's Stagecoach. But play it again, Sam. It's one of the most misquoted lines, and I've misquoted it here. Sometimes it's saved from the blessings of civilization. You'll see that the actual line is, well, that saves them the blessings of civilization. But you'll see it misquoted more often than not. So, I'd actually just like to begin with a little clip from the end of the film. In fact, it's the final scene.
See that you could get to my place across the border. Well, goodbye, Dallas. Maybe you'd like to ride away with the kid. Please.
Kid's going to prison. That's the sheriff taking it.
Saved from the blessings of civilization? Yeah. Doc, I'll buy you a drink. Just one.
In the final shot of John Ford's Stagecoach, the Ringo Kid, played by John Wayne, and Dallas, played by Claire Trevor, sits atop a buckboard, harnessed to a matched pair of horses, and ride off into the distance. The outlaw and prostitute head out for a new life together as man and wife in Mexico, where the Ringo Kid has a small spread. As the credits roll, their receding figures are framed by the unmistakable high desert landscape of Monument Valley, a place that Ford's Westerns helped to make iconographic, a visual synonym for the American West and the American Western. It would seem that we could not be farther from the cosmopolitan worlds of European high modernism, the London of Virginia Woolf, Yeats, Wyndham Lewis, Gautier Jeska, and Jacob Epstein, the Paris of Proust, Matisse, Picasso, Breton, Stravinsky, Goncharov, and Buñuel, the Berlin of Alfred Dublin, Fritz Lang, F.W. Murnau, Brecht, Weil, George Grosz, and Walter Gropius. That Ringo and Dallas leave the modern world behind is confirmed in the penultimate scene of Stagecoach, when Doc Boone, played by Thomas Mitchell, along with the sheriff, Curly Wilcox, played by George Bancroft, have sent the lovers off. It's Doc who says, well, that saves them the blessings of civilization. It would seem that the American West and the Hollywood Westerns of John Ford might stand as the antithesis of European modernity and Euro-modernism, respectively. Indeed, when Stagecoach premiered in 1939, Frank Nugent in the New York Times praised the epic scale, wide-open spaces, narrative simplicity, and the lack of artistic artifice, shading, and subtlety, which for him distinguished John Ford's picture. He went on, by the way, to write scripts for John Ford. John Ford has swept aside 10 years of artifice and talky compromise and has made a motion picture that sings a song of camera. It moves across the plains of Arizona, skirting the sky-reaching mesas of Monument Valley, beneath the piled-up cloud banks, which every photographer dreams about. Mr. Ford is not one of your subtle directors, suspending sequences on the wink of an eye or the precisely calculated gleam of a candle in a mirror. He prefers the broadest canvas, the brightest colors, the whitest brush, and the boldest possible strokes. It's a lot for black and white film. He hews to the straight narrative line. He takes no shadings from his characters, either they play it straight or they don't play it at all. He likes his language simple and he doesn't want too much of it. When his redskins bite the dust, he expects to hear the thud and see the dirt spurt up. Above all, he likes to have things happen in the open, where his camera can keep them in view. And yet, as film critics and historians have long noted, Ford was hardly uninterested in modern literature and the artistic avant-garde. In a career stretching more than 50 years, Ford directed films based on the works of many modern writers: Lady Gregory, Lemo Flaherty, Sean O'Casey, Graham Greene, Eugene O'Neill, John Steinbeck, Booth Tarkington, Sinclair Lewis, and Erskine Caldwell, many of whose plays and novels were steeped in the idioms of literary modernism. Nor was Ford's interest in modernism or the avant-garde limited to literature. Tad Gallagher, one of Ford's most perceptive critics, draws our attention to the American director's indebtedness to the German expressionist cinema of F.W. Murnau, perhaps best known for works like Faust, The Last Laugh, and Nosferatu. As Gallagher notes, Ford not only thought Murnau's Sunrise the greatest picture yet made when it appeared in 1927, he also studied the German director's filming techniques and production methods firsthand, both at Fox Studios in Hollywood, where Murnau had immigrated in 1926, and also in Germany, where Ford went in 1927. Murnau's high contrast, expressionist lighting, and stylized scenery, some of which you've already seen in this final scene, his visual compositions, fluid camera movements, distinctive use of montage, and expressive theatrical gestures of his actors all had profound influence on the development of Ford's cinematic aesthetic. Ford's late silent films of the 1920s, such as Four Sons and Hangman's House, most clearly show the influence of German Expressionism. But Murnau's style continued to shape in subtle ways Ford's directorial decisions well into the 1930s and 40s in pictures such as The Informer, The Plow and the Stars, Grapes of Wrath, The Long Voyage Home, and The Fugitive. Still, it comes as something of a surprise to learn that Murnau casts an expressionistic shadow over Ford's Stagecoach, which Blake Lewis has called the single film which did most to revitalize the Western in the sound period. It's the first basically A-list full-feature Western in nearly 10 years, produced by one of the major studios. We shall return to a detailed consideration of the expressionistic elements of Ford's classic Western. But for the moment, we shall merely take note of Gallagher's comment that the final section of Stagecoach, which takes place in Lordsburg, is, quote unquote, an expressionistic melodrama that evidences Murnau's continuing importance for Ford's distinctly American cinematic aesthetic. But in the meantime, I want to suggest that what might seem in Ford's case to be singular, exceptional, or freakish instance of avant-garde influence on a popular American art form of the 1930s is in fact a representative example of a much broader and culturally significant movement in early 20th century America that has gone underexamined. I will argue that Ford's Stagecoach, and to a more limited extent Ford's later Westerns, participated in a distinctive form of vernacular American modernism that emerged in the early 1910s, flourished in the 20s and 30s, and survived in an attenuated fashion in the post-war era. The story of what I'm calling American vernacular modernism is really two cultural narratives that intersect in curious and unpredictable ways. We might begin with a story that we're likely to be familiar with, the tale of expatriate Americans who went to Europe before, during, and most especially after the First World War, and who came to represent a creative generation of cosmopolitan artists who immersed themselves in the new avant-garde aesthetic of London, Paris, Berlin, and other European metropolitan cities. Before the First World War, Henry James, Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, T.S. Eliot, and Jacob Epstein had settled in England. In the 20s, Paris became a gathering place for Pound, Eliot, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Art Crane, Paul Bowles, E.E. Cummings, DeJuna Barnes, Sherwood Anderson, John Dos Passos, Langston Hughes, Joseph Stella, George Hontile, Josephine Baker, the list really goes on and on. Well, I don't mean to suggest that the work of these expatriates ceased to be American. That's not at all what I'm arguing. I think it's fair to characterize their art as imbibing a cosmopolitan aesthetic that they shared with a great many non-Americans with whom they associated in Europe's cultural capitals. U.S. American artists, like their Canadian, Latin American, and Caribbean counterparts, have long maintained a love-hate relationship with European culture, sometimes imitating it and avidly absorbing its influences, at other times repudiating it as intrusive and alien. I will argue that in the early 20th century, a counter-movement in American letters and arts arose partly as a response to the growing influence of Euro-modernist aesthetics that we associate with the likes of Pound, Eliot, Stein, and H.D., not to mention other figures like Philip Johnson, the architect who was an early advocate of the international style. This vernacular form of American modernism emerged from a revived interest in the natural landscape, flora, fauna, peoples, and regional cultures of the American West, most conspicuously those of the American Southwest and the Great Plains, an interest, however, that might range over the whole country from the Mississippi to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, and on occasion cross over into the Rio Grande in Mexico, or fix on the American frontier of a bygone era, such as Appalachia. Though self-consciously rooted in a particular geographic and cultural region, American vernacular modernism was nevertheless characterized by an implicit and sometimes even an assertive nationalism. It was distinctively and inescapably American, deliberately and paradoxically drawing for inspiration on regional traditions. That's one of the points I want to make. Though nationalist, it nevertheless was also regional at the same time. That much of America, particularly the big cities of the eastern seaboard, might seem to belong to a transatlantic European and cosmopolitan civilization, posed for American vernacular modernists not a problem, but a cultural provocation and an opportunity to redefine Americanness. As fans of John Ford's My Darling Clementine might remember, city slickers from the East with their European cultural refinements, such as the Shakespearean actor Granville Thorndike, played by Alan Mowbray, aren't necessarily or admired or much appreciated by their rough, gun-toting country cousins on the frontier, likely to shoot out the legs of the Shakespearean actor on the stage out west. American vernacular modernism can be regarded as one of those repeated attempts on the part of irascible, rebellious, and non-conforming New World artists to resist the temptations of European modernity, to refound the country and the culture on home soil in which alien species must adapt or perish. But I don't want to be too quick to divide American modernists into two strictly separated and opposing camps: the cosmopolitan Euro-modernists and the American vernacular modernists. As our brief consideration of even Ford has suggested, when you look underneath the roughly tanned leather riding coat of the latter, you can often catch a glimpse of the European fancy dress of the former. Besides Ford, our brief catalog of the two groups reveal a number of writers and artists who spent time abroad imbibing Euro-modernist aesthetics before refounding themselves and their art as regional, Western, and assertively American. Marston Hartley was a sometime expatriate painter who, before the First World War, lived briefly in Berlin, where he became acquainted with Vasily Kandinsky and Franz Marc, came under the influence of Die Blaue Reise and German Expressionist painting. Hartley lived in Paris in the 1920s, where he mixed with Stein's circle of artists, before he returned to the US, where he eventually became, along with Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the representative painters of the American Southwest. Virgil Thompson, who composed the score for Pere Lorenz's groundbreaking documentary films of the 1930s, The Plow That Broke the Plain and The River, also resided in Paris between 1925 and 1940, where he studied music with Eric Satie and Nadia Boulanger, and was an intimate friend and artistic collaborator of Stein. In the 1920s, his fellow American composer, Aaron Copland, also studied with Boulanger, where he fell under the spell of the works of André Gide, mixed with the likes of Stein, Picasso, Modigliani, and came under the musical influence of Ravel, Satie, Milhaud, Honegger, Poulenc, not to mention Webern, Baird, Schoenberg, and Bartók. An awful fancy and highfalutin resume for a composer of such popular American classics as Billy the Kid, Rodeo, Appalachian Spring, and the score for The Red Pony. Although I've so far spoken of American vernacular modernism as if it were a single unified cultural phenomenon, it would be more accurate to refer to it in the plural, as it encompassed a wide variety of distinctive artists, artistic methods, styles, movements, networks, and circles that can only be loosely related to one another, according to Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance. The most conspicuous and influential works in the American vernacular modernist tradition don't necessarily share all of the same features and preoccupations, and no one attribute or characteristics of this movement is essential or invariable. In fact, the most prominent American artists who I'm calling vernacular modernists, John Ford, Pere Lorenz, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Paul Strand, George O'Keeffe, Marsden Hartley, Willa Cather, John Steinbeck, Mary Coulter, Frank Lloyd Wright, Maria Montoya Martinez, Copeland, Virgil Thompson, and Martha Graham worked in an especially broad range of arts and media, including cinema, painting, photography, fiction, architecture, interior design, ceramics, music, and modern dance. Necessarily, the grammar of American vernacular modernism varied according to the particular medium or art in which it was developed. But we can nonetheless associate a seemingly serendipitous group of artists and their works by means of overlapping sets of motifs, subjects, and representational modes that were commonly rooted in, suggested by, or focused upon the American frontier. Before looking closely at Ford's visual imagery and use of landscape in relationship to the photographs of Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and Paul Strand, and as well to the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe, I want to mention just a few of the other notable characteristics of what I'm calling American vernacular modernism. Though the American West, or at least its cinematic representation in Hollywood and Westerns, is often, or perhaps mistakenly, alleged to have been a strictly man's domain, one characterized by violence and a hyper-masculine ethos, one in which the concerns of women were marginalized or devalued. The fact is that women played an extraordinarily prominent, even decisive role in American vernacular arts movement that I'm describing. For example, the novels of Willa Cather, particularly The Professor's House and Death Comes to the Archbishop, as well as her so-called Prairie Trilogy, occupy a central place in the literary flourishing of American vernacular literary modernism. Even more than the fiction and screenplays of her contemporary, John Steinbeck, Cather's works exemplify a lifelong fascination with the American frontier, including the Midwestern plains where she grew up, and the southwestern high deserts and mountains where she spent much time traveling and vacationing in the latter half of her career. In the field of architecture, a figure that you may be unfamiliar with, that of Mary Coulter, exemplify an important vernacular synthesis of various architectural styles: Spanish colonial revival, Pueblo revival, and mission revival styles that flourished in the first 4 decades of the century. Between 1905 and 1939, Coulter designed several of the most prominent buildings in and around the south rim of the Grand Canyon National Park: Hopi House, Hermit's Rest, Lookout Studio, and Desert View Watchtower, as well as the La Posada Hotel in Winslow, Arizona. She also took a decisive hand in redesigning the interiors of the La Fonda Hotel in Santa Fe and Union Station in Los Angeles. See the floor of Union Station, Los Angeles, which is designed to look like a Navajo blanket. And these, which appear to be ancient ruins, are in fact quite modern. In fact, this section was built precisely to appear as if it had already been a ruin. Mm-hmm. And you're looking at the interior of this tower on the lower left-hand section. Cather and Coulter have plenty, I should suggest that Cather and Coulter have plenty of female company among vernacular modernists. The early 20th century Renaissance in Southwestern poetry. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Coulter's work is not nearly as well known as Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural works, particularly Taliesin West, his home in Arizona, and you're seeing a photograph of that on the lower right, as well as the Santa Fe Opera House or the textile block houses in Los Angeles. But like Coulter, I consider Frank Lloyd Wright to be another really interesting instance of a vernacular Americanist and modernist idiom. More to say about him later. But to return to the question of pottery, I wanted to mention another figure with which you might not be familiar, Maria Montoya Martinez. Beginning in 1913, with the encouragement of the archaeologist and anthropologist Edgar Lee Hewitt, and the assistance of philanthropists Vera von Blumenthal and Rose Dugan, the mentoring of Serafina Tafoya, and the contribution of her husbands, Julian, Maria Martinez helped to resuscitate and perfect the lost Neolithic art of black-on-black pottery, for which the Southwest is now just famous. From the time of the first recorded exhibition of her pottery in the New Mexico Art Gallery in 1920, the Tiwa artist from San Ildefonso Pueblo gradually emerged as one of the great ceramists of American history, a frequent guest at the White House and an artist of global significance who helped to inspire indigenous artistic revivals throughout the world. No short list of the key figures of American vernacular modernism would be complete without the dancer, choreographer, and impresario, Martha Graham, one of the driving forces behind the emergence of modern dance. Graham's choreography in the 30s and 40s represented another significant flowering of vernacular modernism, beginning in 1935 with her work Frontier, and continuing through works such as American Provincials, Panorama, American Document, El Penitente, Letter to the World, and Salem Shore, and culminating in her 1944 collaboration with Aaron Copland, Appalachian Spring. Graham helped to create a whole new language in dance, one expressly American, avant-garde, and steeped in the evolving life and culture of the frontier as it moved westward from the Puritan settlements of the Atlantic seaboard over the Appalachian Mountains and onto the Great Plains of the Midwest. Finally, while no artist herself, Mabel Dodge Lujan should be regarded as one of the great patrons, movers, and shakers of this movement. Having relocated to Taos in 1917, the wealthy heiress helped to establish an artist colony that flourished in the 1920s. In New Mexico in the 20s and 30s, Dodge hosted an extraordinary range of writers and artists, including many of them that we've discussed already: Marsden Hartley, Martha Graham, Ansel Adams, Willa Cather, George O'Keeffe, but also Aldous Huxley and D.H. Lawrence. If vernacular modernism was avowedly American, it also tends to be unapologetically democratic, egalitarian, and populist in spirit. I don't deny that many of these artists and writers could be supercilious, demanding, overbearing, proud, egocentric, even authoritarian. John Ford, George O'Keeffe, and Frank Lloyd Wright were famously so. But I would nonetheless suggest that they generally understood themselves to be cultivating art forms meant to appeal broadly to an American audience. To be sure, many of them sought out patrons, and sometimes outraged and rejected conventional and bourgeois tastes and mores. Even so, I detect a strong populist impulse in their art, one manifest in the subjects they chose, and in the audience to which they appealed. In my view, they understood themselves, unlike their counterparts such as Eliot Pound and Stein, to be anti-elitists who favored a strenuously democratic aesthetic. Ford's westerns, O'Keeffe's New Mexican landscapes, Ansel Adams' nature photographs, Maria Martinez's Indian pottery, and so forth, including Graham's dances and Copland's film scores and ballet suites, were widely celebrated and immensely popular in their day. Just as an example, the negative production cost for Stagecoach was about a little over $500,000, while the grosses were nearly $1 million in the first year alone. And Ford was personally paid $50,000 to direct the picture, which, as I calculate, using the CPI deflator, I know, not the best, but it's about $860,000, 2017. So these works were not only popular, but as I'm also going to argue, they were profitable. I hate to generalize too freely about the political valences of American vernacular modernism, if only because these figures were not of one line. Not a few of them were decidedly iconoclastic and eccentric. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to characterize many, if not most of them, as progressives. Ford, Pere Lorentz, Paul Strand, Steinbeck, Thompson, and Copland were advocates and sometimes actual propagandists working in an official capacity for the New Deal. Copland appears to have been, for at least a brief time, a member of the Communist Party. Strand may not have carried a red card, but his sympathies for communism and specifically for Stalinism are now well attested. Now, by contrast, Cather, who edited a progressive magazine, McClure's, was nonetheless, according to her biographer, a lifelong Republican, privately critical of FDR and the New Deal. What further complicates any characterization of the political trajectory of American modernism, vernacular modernism, is its considerable commercial success. To be sure, some, like the documentarian Pere Lorentz, depended for his livelihood on commissions from the Roosevelt government, the short-lived Resettlement Administration and the Farm Security Administration. Virgil Thompson, who wrote the scores for Lorenz's two best-known films, similarly benefited from government largesse, but was not particularly reliant upon it. And there were others like Mary Coulter, who worked for private firms, the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad, that in turn depended for their success on government contracts. But allowing for these exceptions, American vernacular modernists such as Ford, Wright, O'Keeffe, Copeland, Adams, Steinbeck, Taft, and Graham generally marketed their populist arts for a relatively robust financial rewards. They not only survived, but they prospered in the marketplace. While for various reasons, many of these artists remained wary of big business, they could also see in their own commercial success a validation of their democratic sympathies and populist principles. Commercial art appealed directly to a public who could show their appreciation in a similarly direct fashion by expressing their preferences through their purchases, by buying a ticket, by buying the wares that a vernacular modernist had to sell. While many other but not invariable features of American vernacular modernism merit our attention, one final characteristic demands our consideration. Although the artists who popularized vernacular modernism tended to focus upon stark, uninhabited, savage, or inhospitable, but nonetheless sublime landscapes of the American West, their works are paradoxically haunted by the specters of urban cityscapes and the problems of cosmopolitan life that their art only apparently expunged. The turn to the natural and primitive world in the American West is thus doubly conditioned by the problems of modernity and modernization. The West becomes a popular antidote for the maladies of urban life. But the artist who heads into the setting sun never completely shakes the nagging fear that modern life cannot truly be left behind, that modernity is our inescapable condition. Which is to say that the journey west, which is supposed to serve as a kind of ritual purgation, a purification of the American spirit, may deepen the sense of sin. Cain departs for the wilderness to reclaim his lost innocence, only to discover that his journey west provides new opportunities to confirm and even indulge his fallen state. One way in which the process of purgation and purification occurs is through a renativizing of the European inhabitants. I'm actually going to skip this because I do want to get to the kind of visual rhyming that is going to take place here. I wanted you to see Ford's use of Monument Valley, which is characteristic of these films. And he used them in no fewer than 7 westerns. And we'll see that in a very brief clip here, him use Monument Valley to reintroduce.
Hey, look, the Gringo! Yeah. Hello, kid. Hello, Curly.
The Ringo Kid is monumentalized as an outlawed hero by Monument Valley itself, even while Ford is helping to make Wayne into a Hollywood star. In yet another scene, and I'm going to skip it, we'll see a famous shot. The landscape overwhelms and belittles the representatives of civilization, a way of making the problems of modernity literally disappear from view. We turn our backs. Let's see, I should actually clip here. It's actually quite a bit of the film. You can see how much Ford relies on likes this so much. The landscape here is nativized. The Indians may be hostile, but their presence generates dynamism, drama, action, and even camera movement, which is quite rare in Ford's films. He likes to use the camera in a fixed position. The problems of modern passengers are going to be erased or resolved by having to deal with the more basic problem, the Indian attack on the stagecoach. Now, before we get any farther, I'm actually going to skip over a number of scenes which these are sort of the historical background kinds of sources that Ford was using. But I want to get to the characteristic features of the Western landscape that Ford relies on that shows up as well among a lot of these other artists. And so what we're looking at are New Mexican landscapes of George O'Keeffe in the 1930s and 40s, mainly near our home in Abiquiu. And we'll see that they look remarkably like Ford's own landscapes. Now, this kind of visual rhyming is important because what I'm trying to do is establish that there's a kind of common idiom that runs across all of these different movements. So to take just another example, very specific icons, what I would call the blasted or twisted tree. Here we have an Ansel Adams photograph, a Paul Strand photograph, another Ansel Adams photograph, a George O'Keeffe painting, an Edward Western photograph, another George O'Keeffe painting. So what we begin to see is kind of vocabulary building up. Yet another example, sand dunes. Here, Paul Strand, Edward Weston, George O'Keeffe, or the distinctive architecture of the region, in this case, adobe-style churches. Ansel Adams, George O'Keeffe, Paul Strand. It's no accident they're actually painting the very same building, but in any case, churches factor very heavily again, and this is what I mean by sort of nativizing this tradition. In this particular case, the churches of earlier sort of New Mexican settlers, in this case, the Spanish colonial period. Here's a shot from George O'Keeffe. You'll notice that the production designers of Stagecoach are clearly influenced this, partly to reflect historical accuracy, but you're seeing the same kind of adobe interiors when very different kinds could have been used. And one final motif here, cacti, right? And particularly the saguaro cactus, right, from Ansel Adams. Here, the scene of Tombstone. The plausibility of a cactus in the middle of the street of Tombstone seems somewhat dubious, but it gives you an idea of the necessity of requiring these kind of iconographic figures. More from Ansel Adams, and again, because I happen to love O'Keeffe's paintings, this one is really striking because we're going to get a scene from later in John Ford's career, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and there it is again. Here's the cactus walk of the scene. I would show it, but I think the point is made just by the film grab from John Ford's Stagecoach, where Ringo and Dallas are courting each other. Something as simple as fences and roads. Scenes from Ansel Adams, from John Ford's My Darling Clementine, a photograph by Paul Strand, another shot by John Ford's From My Darling Clementine, George O'Keeffe, and yet another Ansel Adams photograph. Now, I find this last one suggestive because what we're really seeing here is what I would call the modern subtext of what we're seeing. We saw only dirt roads, now we're seeing paved roads. And rather than think this is peculiar, I want to suggest that this is in fact what's going on much of the time. So let's take a look at George O'Keeffe's Cliff Chimneys from 1938. What's striking is how much it resembles her paintings when she was in New York in the Steeples Circle. You see this here? You see these kinds of, if you will, city canyons matched by actual canyons out of New Mexico, more canyons. I'm just now intercutting to suggest what the actual kind of modern substratum of this Western iconography really is. Now, when we move to sort of large-scale format photographs by Ansel Adams, we seem to be seeing nature unsullied and beautiful. And yet, what's on the other side? Ooh, damn. Similarly, with Edward Weston, we're getting Lake Tanganyika. He too is photographing Hoover Dam at exactly the same period of time. Ford, who is interested in the Western, is not above sneaking in very modern elements, namely bridges. And a lot of these, of course, are constructions associated with the New Deal, with transforming the landscape, an attempt to address the problems of poverty during the Depression. And just one final one. This one's actually taken from way west, namely Hawaii, Honolulu. But it's an Ansel Adams photograph, and guess what he does at roughly the same time? The Los Angeles freeway system. So, again, what I'd like then to do is to go back to Ford's film in just the little time that remains, and to suggest that Ford is himself a kind of modernist. I'm going to play this little dialogue just in case you don't think that Ford is concerned with the New Deal. Here's a bit of the dialogue. Oops, sorry.
I can't get over the impressions of that gentleman. I'll let you off that pigtail. For it's part of the market. We pay taxes that are what we get. But we don't protection from the army. I don't know what the government is trying to do. Instead of protecting his men, it pumps its schools into this. We're even talking now about having banking centers. As if we taxes don't have on our own banks. Why don't I actually have a letter from a popular official saying they were going to respect my books? I haven't stolen the church place on every expense of the country. The man of organism, the government must not interfere with business. Reduce taxes. Our national debt is something shocking. Over $1 billion a year. What this country needs is a businessman for president.
This country needs more public.
All right, so the send-up of the banker in Stagecoach is really, it is funny, but it's clearly more relevant to the 1930s after the Banking Acts of 33 and 35 than it is to New Mexico and Arizona in 1881, which is when the actual state. In what sense is Ford a modernist? Well, just consider the literary sources of Stagecoach. It's apparently an Ernest Haycock short story called Stage to Lordsburg, published in Collier's Magazine in 1937. But when interviewed by Peter Bogdanovich, Ford claimed that the idea was Guy de Maupassant's story. It was really boule de souffle, and I imagine the writer, Ernie Haycock's, got the idea from there. It sounds preposterous, but in fact the two stories do closely resemble each other. Who are the characters in Stagecoach? The Ringo Kid, a convicted felon and escapee and outlaw. Dallas, a prostitute. Doc Boone, an alcoholic doctor. Hatfield, a fallen Southern gentleman, but also a professional gambler. Mr. Samuel Peacock, who we just see in this scene, a whiskey seller. Henry Gatewood, a corrupt and dishonest banker. He's in fact embezzled the money from the bank, which is why he's upset about government intervention. Lucy Mallory, a wife of a senior military officer. All of them are outwardly Western characters, but all conform to Eastern urban stereotypes. Indeed, they tend to typify characters and the problems of crime-ridden, corrupt urban environments on the East. Both the Doctor and Greenwood are in fact additions to the original story by Haycock. That is to say, and two characters are eliminated, one English and one a cattleman, who you think would be more appropriate. So the fact is that Ford adds, along with the screenwriter, those characters most associated with the East Coast. How about the journey of the Stagecoach? We naturally assume, as in all Westerns, that we should be moving from east to west. Right? But in fact, if we plot the actual geographic journey, we are moving from west to east and south to north. that is from Bisbee in Arizona into more civilized territory in Lordsburg, even though we have to pass through country being raided by Geronimo. The entire film is punctuated then by scenes out in the wide open in the West with interior shots like this, or even sets like this, or a very short scene that I will show here in which Dallas and the Ringo Kid walk through Lordsburg, our destination, after they escape from the Indians. And here you'll see sort of German expressionism in terms of key lighting, high contrast, chiaroscuro. So far from the Wild West, actually, we're plunged back into the problems of Maupassant, of Zola. I'm going to cut short this scene because we're running a little short of time, because I want to show you one of the oddest and really the sort of last scene I'll be able to show you, which is what I've called the expressionist gunfight. Right? So this is the final confrontation between the Plummer brothers and the Ringo Kid. And I want you to note, here we are in the Wild West, but what's featured in the foreground? Gaslight. Right? Notice the way in which he will use shadows just the way Fritz Lang or Murnau does in films, and we get violence in the urban streets. Watch these shadows, because they're all great. You could be watching Fritz Lang's M here around your So what am I suggesting? We get wide open spaces of the West intercut with these scenes of an urban environment associated with all the problems of metropolitan, urban, and even European culture. It's the purgatorial journey through the West that makes possible, however, a kind of community among the passengers who are split according not only to gender, but according to class, according to a set of moral and religious differences, but they are, for better or worse, unified so long as the Apache are adapted. Ford went on to have a much more, how we should say, generous view of Native Americans elsewhere in films, but not in this one. Here they really are sort of props. So the ending of the film is at once upbeat. That is to say, Ringo and Dallas, a convict and a prostitute, are allowed to escape together. But their happiness is ensured only by once more setting out to a new frontier. They have to be saved from the blessings of civilization in order to pursue their life in Mexico, which becomes yet the newest version of the frontier and the Wild West. Let me conclude by just saying that Ford's influence on later directors is considerable. Orson Welles once said that he prepared for making Citizen Kane by watching Stagecoach over 40 times. And he used some of Ford's own crew as well. But in any case, what I'm now trying to conclude and wrap up here is that American vernacular modernism that is only sort of outwardly, but importantly rooted in the West, Meanwhile, and the West becomes this vehicle or this environment, this place in which the problems of urban European modernity can be reworked. And it's precisely this kind of experiment with an alternate environment that becomes so important. I think you've seen this as well in all of the other visuals I've tried to explain. We went into other areas such as architecture, for instance, or for that matter, the compositions of Virgil Thompson and Aaron Copland. I make a similar argument that would require moving into, obviously, different fields altogether. Let me just conclude with one final thing, and that is that I don't think that the American vernacular modernism in the United States is unique. I think that there are corresponding movements that take place globally in other areas. In Mexico, for instance, the Mexican muralists, or composers like Carlos Chavez or Silvestre Revueltas. In Canada, the movements in painting associated with the Group of Seven and Lawrence Harris, or figures like Emily Carr, who were working out west. I could go on and on, but just to take one final example, in Argentina, you think of Borges, who spent time, as did many of these other figures, in Paris in the 1920s, moving among the surrealist set. And the first thing he does when he returns to Buenos Aires in the late 1920s is to establish a magazine called El Sur. And what does it take as its emblematic figure? The gaucho. And so Borges starts writing stories about gaucho. So I think there's a really interesting story to be told about the way in which you get this kind of counter movement that is fully informed by high modernism, but at least on the surface sort of repudiates its language in favor that something that's naturalized, nativized, nationalistic, and sort of explicitly anti-cosmopolitan. Thank you, that's where I'm going to end for today. I'm happy to answer questions or carry on discussion.
I was just kind of curious as to why you might think that Ford didn't go more with the valorization of Native Americans that we find in painters like Maynard Dixon, who I think rhymes equally. Like,
yeah,
but there's so many examples, like the different artists in Taos and so on. And I'm just kind of curious because they were obviously placed.
Well, it's interesting. I think even here you already see his sympathy. In other words, clearly the plot requires them to be hostiles. But we get one of the few close-ups, and they are kind of these heroic photographs a la someone like Edwin S. Curtis, one of the great photographers of the American Southwest and of Native Americans. And it was very clear from the way in which Brian Glendon, who is the cinematographer for this, actually was using Edward S. Curtis's photographs as kind of ways of shooting the Navajo had to fill in for the event.
But I mean, Dixon was doing the same thing. He had these monumental images of Native Americans with the vast landscapes.
Unfortunately, I had to kind of...
Yeah, no, I understand it. That's an interesting...
30 slides. But yeah, I agree with that. And indeed, I think as you get farther and farther into Ford's work, he carries out a strategy that I see is common to a lot of these other figures. Rather than simply depicting Native Americans as hostiles, they actually become, if you will, emblematic of what is best about the West. That is to say, their life is in fact at least implicitly praised. And even some of Ford's most famous or infamous characters, like Ethan in Searchers, right? He is routinely described as racist and hates the Comanche. I think that's fair enough. But the fact is that he turns out to speak numerous Indian languages. He knows all about their religious aspects. He's adopted most of their customs, including scalping, for instance. So he is this kind of equivocal character, I think, who both embodies what is, for Ford, the alternative to the corruptions of civilized society.
Yeah, and I was thinking of people like, Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, or even Emily Carr with all of her Native American image, or Canadian image.
I mean, partly I think Ford is kind of caught into a genre in which he's got to sort of work against it. Although he went back far enough in time to The Vanishing American, which is a silent film from 1925, and the first time Monument Valley is used, that's explicitly an attempt to make a kind of elegiac apology on behalf of Native Americans.
So you mentioned that this is a regional style, but I was wondering, are there other vernacular modernisms that are representative of the other regions of the U.S.?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you could look at sort of the so-called regionalists like Thomas Hart Benton or Grant Wood, for instance. I think you could look at figures like John Marin, who's working in New England. So I think that different regions would adapt, might use different kinds of lexicon or grammar in terms of the subjects that they represent. But I think the strategy is in some ways the same. That's why I try to make the point at the end that this isn't just limited to the Western United States. So if you happen to be an Argentinian like Borges, you turn to the Gaucho. If you're a Peruvian novel like Arguelles, he writes novels in Quechua and in Spanish, kind of regrounds it in the Andes. Right? So I think that what we get is a highly flexible strategy for, if you will, nativizing, naturalizing, nationalizing forms of modernism that speak to particularly a particular region. And it's interesting, it's very rarely the case that even when you move outside of the United States, that what I'm calling vernacular modernisms try to cover the whole country. They always take one region as representative for the country as such. So the Gauchos, for instance, are just one part of Argentina. They hardly represent Buenos Aires, but that's precisely the point.
To follow up on that, you mentioned the architect.
Mary Coulter.
Frank, right. Like, so his work in Pennsylvania, for example, uses the native elements there, the trees, the rocks, the steel, and so on.
So organic.
Yes, so he's some of the same philosophies are there, but in each region he's picking it up. But it's well known that at least with Falling Rock and so on, even though he loved it, he just did this because they gave him money and he wanted to retire at this point. So I'm asking a somewhat cynical question. Is this certain groups of people taking some philosophies or some discussion about human nature which they want to explore? Or are they just simply rebranding these ideas so they can be commercially successful in the country they're in?
It's a really difficult question, and I can't give you a simple answer because I think in each particular case it's very complicated. I mean, one of the points I've tried to make is I do think these tend to be commercially viable. That is to say, unlike, say, Wallace Stevens has to work for an insurance company. Pound ends up basically sucking up to Mussolini, trying to get a position when he's in Italy as kind of cultural czar. T.S. Eliot works for Lloyd's, but they're not really making money on their art. One of the interesting things about this kind of more popular form is that it is saleable, so it has commercial value. And as I also tried to suggest, it validates the artist who wishes to reach the people, especially people with money. Not to put too fine a point on it, but in some cases we're seeing kind of mass-produced things. So, the interesting thing about Frank Lloyd Wright was, for a variety of mainly political reasons, he didn't tend to get government contracts. Hoover had a file on him, and so forth. I guess the short answer is, are they trying to make money? Absolutely. And in some cases, that's the explicit reason that a whole art form got started. So Maria Montoya Martinez is basically just a poor Indian potter working in San Ildefonso Pueblo. And it's only when Paul Hewitt, who's an archaeologist who has excavated ancient pottery from about 1000 AD, says, I need to reconstruct this stuff. I need to find a local potter that has talent as a ceramist. And so she puts these things together and tries to basically create prototypes of what these shards would look like when reassembled. And Hewitt then says, this stuff is great because that it can be sold back east. And so what begins as a kind of purely archaeological undertaking ends up being commercially viable first for, a very elite clientele, but gradually becomes more and more popular. So if you go to, Santa Fe today, you'll find there's an enormous industry in pot. It's just huge. And unsurprisingly, most of the potters claim direct descent from Maria Martinez through about 5 generations, and legitimately so.
I just want to, we're after noon, so I just want everyone to be aware of that. But you also argue in the paper that Ford's vernacular modernism is critical, populist, but critical. How do you understand, or how
Yeah, I
are
think
we
that's where the
navigating?
sort of New Deal stuff comes in. In other words, I think that he's interested in suggesting, one, that there are problems in European modern culture specifically. So it's not just that you have drunken doctors out west, or prostitutes, or outlaws, or fighting. This is, gunfights in the street. Interestingly enough, if we look at the actual historical evidence, there's far more crime taking place in eastern urban cities in the 1870s and 1880s than even in Tombstone, whether you measure it, in absolute numbers, per capita, any way you want to cut it. So that the wild, wild west is kind of an eastern projection. I'm not saying that there's no violence taking place there. So part of that reformist movement is, first of all, just to identify the source of problems. What does Geronimo want? And the Apaches. They just want to be free. They want to reclaim their own land. So there's no kind of moral critique. They're, quote unquote, the hostiles. But yeah, well, you are Westerners out here, having taken the land, and Ford makes no attempt, I think, to criticize them. They do serve a plot function, but their motives are, at least here, and in most of his other films, pure by comparison. The reformist elements, I think, are, at least in the 1930s, like, there can be these changes. And here we see, one change might be banking regulations. I know that's a weird way of saying it, but I mean, the whole parody of the banking industry here is, here's this guy saying, we don't want to be regulated, why do we need, government at all? And we know as audience that, what is he carrying in his case? He's carrying all the funds that he's embezzled from the town of Tonto, and he's trying to get out of town before it's detected. He thinks that the telegraph wires have been cut, and he doesn't realize when he arrives in Lordsburg, they're going to be there to arrest him.
Last question.
So, Michael, I'm Ian Barnard from the English department, and I enjoyed your presentation very much, but I guess I wanted to ask you some questions about the larger context of your visit. As you are no doubt aware, there's a lot of controversy on campuses throughout this country about the Koch Foundation's funding of academic positions, and certainly there's a lot of controversy on this campus and in the English department, a lot of conflict around this. So I was sort of curious, I guess I have 2 questions for you. If you were offered and accepted this position, A, do you feel like there are any ethical issues involved? And B, how do you imagine you might sort of frame yourself as a scholar and an academic and a professor in the English department, in relation to the funding sources of your position?
I'm not privy to the inside information of how the funds move once they get to Chapman, but I won't be taking a paycheck directly from the Kochs.
Mm-hmm.
So I will be paid by Chapman just like any other faculty. I have no particular arrangements with them, nor have I been asked to sort of direct my research in any given direction. So, I mean, I hope you've had a chance to take a look at, the CV, my, writing, my research, and my talks kind of range over a whole, kind of wide compass of topics. Some of them, intersect at times, or at the junction of, let's say, economics, political theory, and literature. But if you're asking me, am I taking any sort of directives, or do I have a research agenda that's being set by the Koch brothers, I can say emphatically no.
Well, even if you aren't, I mean, there's a perception that you might be. So that's why I'm just wondering if you see this, if you see any ethical dilemmas, or if you don't see this as sort of an ethical
I mean,
dilemma.
I guess, we can we are all in a position, I suppose, if we are truly being self-critical and having to ask who's paying for us. And I don't think that that would be limited to the co-brothers. I certainly grew up on campuses in which anti-apartheid protests were taking place, and the question of not accepting money from certain sources. My own sense is that it's very difficult to find discriminations given the way, if you will, money is fungible within universities or any sort of large corporation. So I hope that addresses your question.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your being with us and responding to our questions.
Thanks.